Hello everyone, today we talk about the economical development of the 13th century. So before the great crisis of the 14th century, of the Black Death, of the economical creaking, let's say, that began to happen essentially at the same end of the 13th century, and especially at the beginning of the 14th, on Schwerpunkt we discussed now relatively often the a bit the premises that are the base of this great moment of expansion in European history between roughly the 10th and the 13th century. I think it's not wrong actually to extend it at the beginning a little bit towards the 8th, but this is not really the point. The point is today we narrow down to the end of this phase, talking about the 13th century, which is a very peculiar century in history. Every century is kind of special in itself, even if the same term of century doesn't mean anything. But we decided to didactically divide it in this way. Um, and the 13th century, by the way, is a century I love. It's characterized by a great, in fact, a great expansion. This is moment of the apex that European society reached at one point before the crisis that basically was not met, especially from a demographical point of view, before actually the late modern age sometimes. So it's also a very enigmatic moment in history because it's actually a century that begins to be relatively well documented in many ways, but at the same time it's a bit of compromise. It's still a relatively primitive world, but yet a system that was overexpanding at a point, and this overexpansion eventually had in its dynamics the seeds for the eventual collapse that occurred quite dramatically in as we've seen in the first half of the 14th century, and affected basically the rest of medieval history in the essentials and changed so much into society and so on. We discussed these things extensively. If you look at the medieval society playlist, it's plenty of topics I discussed that are related to it. But today we will look at kind of the bright side of this 13th century. So looking at the factors that basically contributed to fuel during this same century the growth of the system, of the big system. So basically there are many factors. Naturally, it's never one element that really that triggered this growth, and it was a serious complex of factors that objectively we can't even quantify properly. We can't assess that. We know that there was a sum of factors that brought this expansion, but when you try to go in depth and say, okay, well, it was mostly this thing, you're not really sure, because we don't really know from an historical point of view. Social mechanics are very complex, and unfortunately the sources that remained are not are very scanty for us to understand what really many things actually were about that same society, not even the causes, the premises. So it's very difficult, but there are to understand it, but there are still several factors that can be taken into consideration, and that's what we see today. So we can start from the political side. Recently I made a video about the strengthening of the European monarchies during the 13th century, so that is probably, if you don't want to go a bit in depth into this political development, that's kind of the video that makes it for you. The title is 13th Century Monarchical States. With Roman numerals, by the way, because that's what I use in my titles and so on. So that would be XIII. From essentially during this century, you see the stabilization of political structures. So this is a process that naturally began before in the previous centuries. There is also in here, if you want, a premise to that video as well. I mean, the consolidation of the feudal monarchies or better, the strengthening of the feudal monarchies during essentially the 11th, 12th century. If I'm searching for it. If you give me a second, I might be able to find it. It's a bit of difficulty. Oh yeah, here it is. Construction of the new feudal monarchies, 11th, 12th century. So here you have basically in line these three videos that if you really are so keen and obsessed with this topic, you can follow, you can watch, and to get it more. So this political strengthening had brought essentially to the increase in the capacity of control of local conflicts by the public powers. This is not, just anecdotal, because indeed, if you look at, broadly at society at this point and conceive the political fragmentation that existed, indeed, one of the greatest problems of the Middle Ages had been finding essentially an authority. An authority that could basically bring all Christendom at that point together. There was still pretty much alive the concept of universalism, of the universal empire that theoretically even existed in the Holy Roman Empire in the West, in the East, obviously with the Roman and the Byzantine Empire, and that was theoretically conceived as the normal institutional organization that had to happen in Christian society. And the need for pacification was indeed very strong. You see that in the previous centuries, the monarchies had struggled, in fact, to affirm themselves, to emerge, in order to also to contain certain individualistic attitudes and autonomies that were actively instead fighting against this centralization. There is no really good or evil guy in here, because actually every lord was attempting to achieve this, but there were and even the monarchies were essentially the same thing. They were just bigger lordships. That's how you want to say it. They had a bit of a greater legitimacy, given that they usually derived from the empire, the repetition of the empire of Charlemagne. So essentially, they belonged to, they were just chunks of the bigger empire that had been at that point, but also in there the formalization of that empire had come relatively slowly, and also these monarchies had different histories and also different fates, because some had survived, some had basically vanished, or at least they had been emptied of any institutional substance in the political practice. There was also the vexata question of the cadets of the noble families that went out to be knights, to be errant knights. The church had tried to put an end to the violences that these marauders, because that's basically what they were carrying out within the Christian world, and to channel them, essentially to channel their force, their strengths in these other directions, either in the Iberian Peninsula or the Near East or the Baltic Sea, to basically reverse this phenomenon over at least pagan lands that had to be conquered and in this sense brought to Christendom. Now it's very complex, naturally. Also the Crusades are not so easily explainable. Naturally, that was just one factor. But let's say that society and both the lay and ecclesiastical powers had been quite concerned about this need of pacification, substantially, and that's a need that you find in the legal efforts of every single authority in the Middle Ages, because it's obvious that these were powers that also were interested in disarming the local populations. They didn't want troubles. They wanted to extend their power over the communities, essentially making them sure that they would be subdued, and they didn't have anything to say about that. And that's also how the modern state progressively evolved. If you look at it in perspective, the sake of centralization came with a kind of loss of freedom of the communities. So this is quite also theoretical, because it depends really in here who was who, because objectively the aristocracies were ruling everywhere. There was no moment in history objectively when human societies were there was a pure kind of anarchical state of freedom that did everybody what they liked. It was all, as soon as there was a minimal centralization where this centralization was in the hands of someone that had inherently more power than the others. And even in the more egalitarian societies that people can even think at this point, the most primitive ones, thinking about Scandinavia, they were not stratified, but that was still they were not heavily stratified, I'd say, but it was still the oligarchies that ruled over in here. The 13th century sees basically the increase also of a certain form of centralization, and there are certain public officials that are, I wouldn't say created out of scratch, but out of the blue, but because this is also a very stupid prejudice that exists into the Middle Ages. People think that there was no centralization, and that centralization began at some point because there was someone who invented things like royal public officials. This is not true. Such things had always existed. During the 13th century, there is, however, the opportunity to centralize more, and there is a kind of an acceleration into this. It also starts producing things like bureaucracy, but this net of administrators that tended to basically take away to evoke, I believe, no, that's another thing, doesn't exist in English, but basically to subtract part of the prerogatives of the aristocracies proper, not even of the communities, because the communities, as we've seen, were already relatively framed into this and subdued into this system, but really mostly the nobility that at that point had made up and was keeping to make naturally, and would keep to make for a long time in the future still the the core, for instance, of the political and military power of the kingdom, to essentially strengthen the royal prerogatives and to make this states developing in a more consistent fashion. That there is there are also many factors. Many people also looked at this from the military point of view. They said, oh well, now there were new technologies that were rendering at least certain military engineering obsolete, for which I think about trebuchet, now castles needed to be were fewer but larger, and therefore this needed a centralized government to finance, to invest into this, and to make this to make this kind of strategical infrastructures more effective. So this required a greater control. So many factors that really influenced this process of centralization. Excuse me, I drink a little bit once again. So this was one factor, indeed, and pacification brought to kind of a positive effect, especially in economy, in some ways, because not much, because obviously the state was kind of expanding, increasing taxes partly, and so on. But the previous violence had been enough, essentially, to curb substantially certain economical activities, and this is still a world where naturally you have to imagine that if you were a merchant at this point, you had to cross, through, I don't know, through France, through Germany, let's assume. It was full of different lordships, and basically you had to stop at every single bridge or castle to pay the tolls for passing there, and that naturally was structurally something that affected the European economy even up to very late in time. These are things that were still to be found into the 19th century, extensively in many regions of Europe. So, but however, only just the absence of violence, the idea that there was a strong public authority, certain royal garrisons, also a greater deterrent of the royal army that in this sense could rely on more resources, and therefore acting also quicker at a wider range with more forces, etc., entailed that the local communities felt, however, in terms of public order, freer. To a few centuries before, they had basically to rely on their own forces because the royal authority was so weak they couldn't defend them from, from other lords, from knights errants, from other raids coming from the outside, from the enemies, etc. So at this point, there is a bit all over Europe, mostly in Western Europe, in the westernmost Europe actually. So where the actually the royal power is stronger. That the building of the 13th century monarchies, the strength of 13th century monarchies happened mostly in this, in England, in France, and in the Iberian monarchies essentially. So there were other areas were still very fragmented. That were this didn't really hamper trade all the time. So if you take certain regions of Italy and Germany, these were quite politically fragmented regions as well, but there were other associative forms that kind of brought to that. Think about the Hanseatic leagues, or think about certain political military leagues also in central northern Italy that were essentially kind of weak. They had a weak centralization, but at least they could act collectively towards a certain direction. So there were different experiments, different solutions were to be found for this great need of trade, because that's objectively what you want. I mean, even if you want to expand at the expenses of of your enemy, you still need money, and sometimes the best way to make it is to make a truce with your own enemy and to make a bit of money just to fight eventually against them. Obviously, it's a bit more complicated than this, also in economical theory, but the political fragmentation definitely favored also this intermittent warfare that, however, was also something very costly, so that most of the times the military expenses were contained to that minimum that could allow, however, essentially the trade income to be higher and to keep working on and growing and expanding. This is a moment of great material growth, and now we will arrive to this. Other people like to insist on the to emphasize at least the rather mild climatic phase of that within the 13th century is to be framed essentially. So this is naturally there was a point up to a very few years ago. Well, basically every single major historical dynamic was interpreted on the basis of climate change. But today, historians began to say, well, it's not really so. It's not really like that, because objectively, it's pretty obvious there were climatic changes that affected substantially certain phenomena. But first, we have a very few means to actually assess what an impact this had on human societies, because maybe we can even through, for instance, dendrochronology, for instance, you can assess that, I don't know, a certain phase in history was marked by warmer climate. You can see it in certain regions, in certain places. Also, this is kind of tricky because you don't have, evidence for, a uniform map of how this was. Basically, there are certain studies that are also relatively expensive to do, so we still have a very scanty evidence. It's like, and sometimes we don't even have the material in which to carry out such an inquiry. So this is the results are also relatively debatable in some ways. But even if these were true, which substantially they are in certain cases, the question is, how do we know how this impacted society? I mean, how do we historically assess the exact impact that climate change had on this specific society? How do we know that society was not changing already for other dynamics that were inherent in it? And so this is also quite important. But surely at that time, climate change that could really affect a lot, especially considering this was a pre-industrial society, so a largely agricultural society, where everything was based on the crop rate. And if you have essentially a regular and warming of the climate, so that there is no major imbalances like they are historically registered in fact for the first half of the 14th century with this, I don't know, maybe cold summers, hot winters, hailstorms, something like that, famines and so on. That is marked. In the 13th century there's not quite so. I mean, there is a kind of a regularity, a cyclicity also of the famines that however is basically scattered on a pattern that goes for a firm evolution. And you can see that objectively warming, the climate warming is definitely something that goes well for organisms, especially in heliotrope of the plants, of the cultivations and so on. So this brings, especially in certain areas of Europe where it's colder. Never forget this, that at that time there was a big structural difference between countries that were colder, that had a colder climate, that had a warmer climate. It's pretty evident. Today we have technology that basically goes past that. This was still a very primitive world for our standards. So even living in Poland instead than, I don't know, in Spain, that it made a big deal of difference in terms of agricultural production. So that this is a phase, also this great economical and demographical revival of the High Middle Ages is something that invests paradoxically in proportion more Northern Europe than Southern Europe. Southern Europe was still obviously much more productive than Northern Europe from this point of view, but in proportion the growth was much higher in the north. If you look at for instance, certain countries like England or Germany, this speeded up in terms of economical growth much faster than what France or Italy were doing at that point. Even though France and Italy were way more, quantitatively more productive than these other areas. But it's very important because this means that there were certain countries that were undergoing more intense transformations as well. This is the great expansion, for instance, of the German lands towards the northeast, the Baltic Crusades that went in parallel with also different economical management, basically a transformation of the landscape, the exportation, the export of urbanization, of feudalism, of trade, and so on. So this was due partly, seemingly, also to climate change, and you can look at this broader. This growth in the broader positive economical tendency that had begun in these decades around the year 1000, that we identify more or less as the moment of more intense and more and better identifiable growth, because the growth, as we've said, began before, but objectively it's around the 11th century that with great approximation this thing starts accelerating even, and having this remarkable impact on European society in its expansion. So the developments of the 13th century interest primarily commerce and the production of artifacts. There was a general revival of trade on long range. So these had never disappeared, but also here that they get immensely, let's not exaggerate, but they get solidly intensified. They were sustained, as we've seen, supported by the new political stability and also by the repristination of certain relatively safe conditions on the main ways of the main ways of communicating, the main routes of communication. Also in here, I think I discussed something. There is the Pax Mongolica in this phase. The 13th century is the century of the great Mongolian Empire that eventually broke apart basically in the following century, and the Pax Mongolica had basically opened. That's what we were talking about before. They had basically encompassed great parts of Eurasia, and they excuse me, I'm searching for the video in here, and had cut down most of the tolls that existed before along the way, because naturally everything now belonged to just one leader in theory. Now, the practice was different, but let's say that there were many other political entities between Europe and China that had been destroyed, and now they didn't exact tolls locally anymore, and the Mongols were naturally interested in promoting trade, transcontinental trade, and there is a big deal of communication during the 13th century between Europe and China that essentially would come to an end to the 14th century. So this phase of the 13th century is also a moment of great intercontinental exchange for those time standards. I made some video which deals with that in some fashion, but I can't. I don't know. I think it was the one on Italian trade that dealt with it. You know, if you're more, I haven't made a video exactly on the Pax Mongolica and trade, but there are certain things I said here and there. Medieval Italy here, medieval Italy playlist. Yeah, Italian trade and banking in the 13th, 14th century. That is an interesting video because it takes into consideration both this, phase of development and eventually the financial collapse, and also the crisis of the Mongolian Empire, the closing of the trade routes and so on. So that's kind of an interesting video that explains such things in a relatively greater detail. So, as we've seen, these were all factors, political stability, the opening of trade routes, general pacification. So this put into motion many resources that could now be shifted more safely, and this definitely boosted trade enormously. So this allowed, among the other things, naturally we're saying the 13th century, these are things that happened a bit, even before, and but at this point they get consolidated. Also in here there is the another video I could advise to you, that is the one of the Champagne fairs that now we will discuss. I think the title is A Rise and Fall of the Champagne Fairs. It's a medieval France playlist, can be useful, that discusses exactly this. So these great fairs that were now specialized in the buying and selling of products like clothes, dyes, spices, and where the merchants coming from the most diverse places could meet and to buy and to exchange their goods, mostly on great quantity, at the basically wholesale. This is important because it witnesses this, the structuration of a great system that could move great amount of material, and that material that was required in other areas, different in other regions and so on. This is probably the most important thing, that there is at this point in Europe an interconnection which had kind of always existed, but now was consolidating also through new practices and forms of trade, of banking, of accounting, and so on. So all activities that in turn were triggering the rise in literacy, in general education, and also thanks to the surplus that could be accumulated from these activities. And very famous were in fact the Champagne fairs, that the video about which I suggested to you in detail. And these were the Champagne fairs were organized in northern France, obviously, and they this area had a very important strategical position, economically speaking, because it was basically, excuse me, the area from the privileged exchanges between northern and southern Europe. Chiefly, the Champagne fairs were so important because they were located between the main axis between Flanders and Italy. They at this point were the leading countries in economy, and they had created this net along which the Champagne fairs had developed. Naturally, this had to do also with the great fertility of the northern French soil. So these were fairs that had initially developed because of the agricultural resources, the agricultural surplus that could be collected in here. Relatively to political consolidation, it's not surprising because this area of northern France now was being consolidated under the French monarchy. It was kind of the, by the 13th century, definitely the strongest one in Europe. So also this had brought to this particular area to develop. The Champagne fairs were in fact fairs, plural, meaning there were several cities that were also having their own fair at a specific time of the year. This was naturally related to seasonal cycles in the agricultural production, and basically the merchants toured the cities that worked as exchange markets also for this, not just for selling agricultural resources, but also for essentially now importing other goods like clothes and so on, and selling them. And these were quite important because basically this was a location where that was kind of comfortable for many for many Europeans, geographically speaking, to come to. And these fairs, in fact, were held all the year long, as we have seen, in series. The most famous localities here were Lagny-sur-Marne, Bar, Provins, and Troyes. And these lasted individually, had a fair that lasted roughly 6 weeks each. So you can imagine the variety of products in here, especially the ones that the Italian merchants called as the panni franceschi, which basically means the French clothes. So these, quite prized products coming from, the quite prized clothes produced in northern France and in the Flanders. Because that Flanders now also this time was practically it was split politically between the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire. So they had also these areas had been favored by the relative decentralization. So there was this immediate interest. In fact, France at the end of the 13th century, beginning in 14, would try to expand into Flanders to control this trade. Flanders was beautifully located also because of the it was facing the North Sea and England, from which also much of the wool now was coming from creating these products. In fact, English economy renowningly revolved up to the 18th century to around this production of this export of wool. And that had been the major source of revenue of the English crown. In fact, also episodes like the English Revolution, etc., happened in the 17th century because now this trade was not enough, was not competitive anymore, but it had grown as a sort of standard of where the crown could traditionally put its hands on, and now instead other activities were developing at that point, and the monarchy had necessarily to find resources somewhere. It ended up for ship money and all this stuff. But let's remain to the Middle Ages. What else can we say? So that there were naturally also certain technical or technological, how do you want to call them, improvements in this process, especially in this textile fabric. Excuse me, I close the window because I don't know why people don't work in the morning, but they work at this hour. Stupid. I'm becoming phonophobic in many ways. I can't stand noise. So excuse me for the interruption. What I was saying is that the textile production now was essentially also producing was triggering a certain technological improvements in here. The textile production, in fact, saw a sharp both quantitative and qualitative increase thanks to the use of new machineries. For instance, the fulling mill, for instance, the horizontal pedal loom, that therefore increased the and this brought basically to the production in a shorter time of a more robust fabric. So this meant that these clothes now were also more resistant. There were certain producers that were now specializing in also in luxury goods. It was actually a very florid market. It was in this production. So also the export into faraway lands. The European textiles were exported all over, and not just those. I mean, Europe at this point began to export grain for freaking a lot of grain, especially from southern Europe, all over the Mediterranean, where it. And this is also a very important trend because usually, the thing about the ancient world, it was usually Europe. Importing grain from other areas of the Mediterranean, chiefly Egypt or Tunisia. At this point, Sicily produced a freaking lot of grain, and it was exported also within Europe and outside Europe. So it's also in here there is a broader expansion that starts saturating the markets. At this point, exactly in the 13th century, there is a trade balance that for the first time shifts from the east to the west. So basically the west starts earning more. It starts accumulating also precious materials. Gold starts minting. We'll see it later. There is a video made some time ago that it's actually about the Italian maritime republics. It's called Italian Maritime Republic's Wealth and Power in the Mediterranean, 11th, 13th century. That in part, that's about, mostly about the cities there, but it also discusses this because it shows how these cities had grown mostly gravitating around certain Eastern economies. Think about the golden coins that were used in the Byzantine Empire or in the Islamic world. Now it was the same Italians and also the French kingdom, etc., that were minted once again golden coins, and this meant a lot on the market. It reveals the the economical potential and the financial power of these centers that start in fact to also to expand into financial activities that hadn't existed before, at least on that scale. And this is the point, that intensification of trade stimulated the production of a new coin. And it's in fact exactly in the 13th century that in order to cope with the new needs, several authorities began to mint first actually silver coins. This was this kind of a if you want even a kind of unrefined rough money. Similar dynamics had happened also in the time of the Carolingian Empire, so you realize that this is not just a matter of sheer economy, but also the kind of powers that are, the kind of power you have on trade, on the markets and so on, that allows you to produce this money. And this silver coins naturally had a higher value compared to the other monies that at the time were usually in circulation. And eventually, even as we've said, also golden coins were created, and this also had not been minted ever since the Carolingian times. They had this kind of timid attempt to propose a new, golden coin that could compete, let's say, with the Byzantine and Muslim golds. So there were several of these. The currency system in Middle Ages is a bit of a mess. Also, so it is for the ancient world. There is a huge difficulty in understanding how certain things work. As far as I know, I'm not an expert, but I know that there is a huge debate into this fields when in research and so on, because nobody of the historians of economics really kind of agrees pretty much with each other. But this is perhaps just kind of a cliche. But there were several of these golden coins, because there were several powers now that were producing them. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. There was the so-called Augustal that was coined by Frederick II, the florin in Florence, in Florence, how do you say that? In Florence, and which was also soon imitated by Genoa and Venice, that also invented their own currency, like the ducat, for instance. And there was a great battling around this, because theoretically the minting was by default into Middle Ages a public prerogative. Only public authorities could mint new coin, and it was absolutely compulsorily forbidden to mint coins on your own, to have mints on your own. This was starting to be done, however, at this point, because of evident reasons, because now the economy allowed certain powers to mint their own currency on their own without any concession, and the political situation was fragmented. So there was a minimum of public authority, as we've seen here with Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, etc. There was a general, there is also this problem with authority, for which in the Middle Ages there is always an emperor. There is theoretically always this public authority out there, but in de facto it's just used to by the local communities to say, okay, let's try to side with this guy for our personal interest in gaining a legitimization for such activities in exchange. But at the same time, there were other powers that were fighting against public authority at that point, that started instead minting their own coins. Now, minting a coin, having this right of minting, was an extraordinary privilege at the time, and naturally could derive only from a solid economical power on the market, but it naturally was reinforced if it was the Holy Roman Emperor in person that allowed you to mint your own coin. And naturally, this there was a lot of kind of falsifications, of forgeries. Now, eventually, there were other phenomena like depreciation, diminution in value of this, according to the economical needs and so on. This was kind of the standard economical policies you could carry out at that time. But what is important is that now they started revolving in Europe once again this started revolving in Europe once again after centuries around the currency, from a world that up to that point had been relatively based on mostly barter. It had been a uniquely agricultural world. At this time in the 13th century, you had the rise of financial activities in a scale that was unprecedented in Europe. And this change happens really at so many levels. I mean, you can read it from the sources that there are certain, even the idea of what was a proper gift for a sovereign, for instance. Now, in the past, there were so many gifts in nature, like animals, things that, now there is money. These sovereigns in the 13th century wanted to cash fast, to have lots of coins in their hands, and to start hiring mercenaries and having, because there was a market that was developing out there that was evidently happening on its own for a natural economical dynamics, and the feudal monarchies had to catch up with these developments, as they were, their own political juridical prerogatives had been, in a certain sense, remained backwards compared to this economical development, and now they were trying to expand also towards that direction. That's towards those models. That's how also the strengthening of the 13th century monarchies was happening. I mean, the idea of a fluidification of the kind of the evolution from this eminently agricultural world and the feudal system, and relying on something that looked more like a dynamic financial market, and that was based, in fact, on the on different dynamics. This system, however, was still kind of hybrid, as you can imagine, and it was still mostly dominated by agriculture, indeed, and it would remain up to the industrial times. But it was what is important here, that it was a system that, in part, was obliging also the various political powers to participate to it, and therefore they were essentially entrusting themselves to it. And this is what would bring, in many ways, also to the crisis at the end of the century and at the beginning of 14th century. The major, banking collapses at that point were caused by the fact that all this need for money, for speculation, etc., the contraction in the economy brought to a major decline. Essentially, the crisis started exactly from those monarchies that were more developed. I mean, the major banking crisis, for instance, of the Tuscan, the Tuscan companies, the Lombard companies, etc., happened because now the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of England were insolvent. They didn't have any money to pay for the loans they had gotten from these merchants, and they caused this domino effect that brought to a major collapse, that coupled with a bunch of disasters, and essentially the great famines. Think about the great famine of 1315, 1317, and eventually the Black Death made this world really that had overexpanded. It was a huge system to collapse, to bring down. This system was enormous. At the beginning, I was thinking about I was telling about how this system had overinflated, and historically speaking, we don't even know quantitatively how many, even from a demographical point of view, what the numbers were. But all the hints we have, all the numbers we have, suggest us that this was a huge system. I mean, as we've said, Europe at the beginning of the 14th century, in terms of demographics, was not reached, I think, up to the 17th century, up to the 18th century, something like that. I mean, it was an enormous system. It was developing also in terms of, for instance, wealth distribution. And this is very important, because this world had risen not essentially like, for instance, the 18th century, from a kind of ancien regime that eventually exploded at that point. Think about the French Revolution, exactly because the wealth had been a huge amount of wealth had been concentrated into the hands of the aristocrats in a very few classes. This was a world that had risen essentially in a very in a relatively egalitarian way. I mean, even 13th century feudalism, that is when feudalism was at its peak in many ways, was still, happening in parallel to a development of the cities of certain other communities were relatively free and were accumulating lots of wealth in their hands in a more, homogeneous way. So the actually up to the crisis, you can argue that European society was much more egalitarian in terms of wealth distribution that it would be at the end of the Middle Ages. So there is no improvement in here. So I know many people will surely think that was a sort of linear progress from the Middle Ages, for which, I don't know, the Middle Ages there were this darkness where everybody was a serf, were plug in the land, and then eventually, toward the modern age, things started getting better. It's completely false. It's the other way around. During medieval times, people were not necessarily living better, but they were they had more resources in their hands, and especially there is not a huge difference between the low Middle Ages and the early modern era proper in some terms. But the major difference is instead that after the crisis of the 14th century, the lifestyle, the condition of the population actually started getting worse on average, because the average inhabitant of Europe at that point was a peasant, and it was a peasant who had lost way more contractual bargaining capability than it had before. This is paradoxical. It happened also, for instance, in the Carolingian times. There was a moment you might say, oh well, Carolingian times may brought to a kind of progress, and then eventually towards the High Middle Ages this trigger this revival. But telling the truth, it seems that the condition of the average European freeman was kind of better in terms of individual freedom and also in amount of wealth in per capita than would happen in Carolingian and in post-Carolingian times. This is being shown quite clearly. So there is kind of a sinusoidal trend in here. So, but these major dynamics are important to be understood, to be framed. So in terms of, and I'm not saying necessarily that when people are, there is a higher per capita wealth, things really work better. On the contrary, in some circumstances, it's not always so, because there's also a greater problem in kind of organizing this system. Today we will not talk about it specifically, maybe another time, but in this greater expansion of the system, for instance, wars had increased dramatically, and part of the reason why these wars had increased was also the political fragmentation. So paradoxically, the same one that had granted a higher per capita income because people were freer, more autonomous, but at the same time, this system lacked a kind of a sovereign rule that could put things like functionally together. So even if you look at how historically this progressed, in spite of the worsening of life conditions and so on, however, society as a whole kind of progressed also in a more centralized fashion towards today, where obviously the state has an enormous power compared to the Middle Ages. Today, states is pervasive. It's everywhere in all countries. It doesn't matter whether you live in the United States, if you live into Germany. That's objectively how our freedom is much less reduced than it was before. And so here we should also distinguish between positive and negative freedom. Just another example. Think about our currency today. The banknotes we use today. Okay, banknotes will probably disappear in some time. In general, that's the general idea. But it's paper. It's worth nothing. So this means, for instance, in terms of currency, there is a huge difference between us and the Middle Ages, because in the Middle Ages, nobody trusted the authority because there was no authority at that point. So coins were actually, loaded in precious metal. There were, as we've seen, silver coins, golden coins. That what was made, that what it was also a kind of a show off, because the city or the kingdom who produced that money had its own symbol on them, and that said, look, we produce money in here, so we are so wealthy, we're so powerful, they even mint our own money, so we are a solid economical system, come to invest into it. So that's also why there was a lot of falsification of there were other cities were even trying to not creating their own money, because they weren't so economically stable, but minting their own coin and putting the mark of another city or another kingdom to let people take it more and to speculate on it. Today we have paper in our hands. We don't have an actual wealth. The gold is in the banks, is in the statal reserves. That's what it is. But we go on. So we have a huge trust towards the state, because the state is today something extremely more solid, extremely more consistent than it was in the past. But what I'm saying is that the point I was trying to make is that today we live obviously much better than what we lived in through the 13th century. So even if personally I have kind of a liberal theories, I don't see anything wrong with capitalism in itself, in the economical theory. But you have to realize also that today we live in a much better world, qualitatively, in terms of quality of life and so on. That one that definitely was much more decentralized, had a very few statal authority in there, but it was still a freaking mess. So naturally you say, well, okay, but at that time there weren't certain technologies and so yeah, but that's the point. I mean, those technologies were also used to create a deterrence that at that point it didn't exist. Okay, because at that point it just took you to have a stinky, Moat and Bailey castle to wait, for hundreds of people to besiege you for months in order to make you capitulate. Today we have atomic bombs. You don't even need to get up. You can blow up basically the whole planet Earth just by pushing a button. So it's a wholly different world, but it's not necessarily. This is criticism I do telling truth towards myself, because sometimes I say quite dogmatically, the better it is when a state leaves, people behaving. But if you look at history, you realize that there was a consistent improvement sometimes of living condition, and also where there was a solid state that ensured police. In fact, that ensured a how do you say, public security, which has to be achieved, especially at that time is pretty evident, with also with disarming the populations. And at that time, like we do today, was seen as a form of tyranny, because indeed if it was the lordships, for instance, the kingdoms, that actively disarmed the local populations to make them pay taxes and so on. But even at that time, if you look at it in less dramatic terms, it was objectively something that was much more bargained than imposed after all. And much of also the modern state construction is something that was born essentially through this thing. Like now we maybe as a community we lose some freedom to give the state, I mean to for instance, barracking the soldiers, lodging the soldiers. At one point, and it was a great problem, because the soldiers, especially also in the Middle Ages now, but for a great part of the modern age, were billeted into the civilians' houses, because there weren't no barracks, because the states were too weak, kind of. They didn't have even the means to maintain them, so they just went. These soldiers just stayed there, and you can imagine what they did. I made a video, incidentally, about the French dragonnade. That is essentially is very obscure. It's a chapter in that case in French history, but it basically happened practically everywhere. It's in the, if you're curious about it, it's in the Modern Warfare playlist, which, yeah. The title is Troops Quartering and Dragonnade in the second half of the 17th century. So we're pretty late, this was happening in this fashion. You know, the community at one point, I mean, if you take this is basically happening in the 18th century. If you look at the Habsburgs or the Hohenzollern, the thing was, you know, the community said, okay, we don't want. The typical thing was something like, even we pay taxes to the state. In exchange, we get the troops are not built in our houses. Or maybe we pay to. This was typical also in many communities of the Middle Ages. You know, we don't want to go to war. The commoners, the burghers, these people were objectively not interested in war. They were not military men. They didn't give a damn. They just want their business to go on. The war was detrimental in some ways. I mean, definitely economy was fueled also by war. In this war was a highly remunerative business at this time. But let's say that the individual people didn't want to go fight. This is also what brought to the rise of mercenarism, what brought to also partly to the disarming of the communities in the in exchange for the absence of military service. So this is something that paradoxically brought to the loss of freedom, but it was kind of consensual in many ways, and you should reflect on this, because if you look at history, and this is at least the impression I always had, it's not that people do things because they are kind of wandering. I mean, especially in this kind of structural phenomena that happen more or less homogeneously everywhere, you realize that there were certain dynamics that either imposed it on them, or that basically obliged them to make it happen. Or however, that was the most profitable choice at that point, because otherwise someone else would have basically tried to rebel. And there were such, naturally, episodes, but on the whole, such transformations were kind of less dramatic than others. And what you see, in fact, is that towards the end of the Middle Ages, also the feudal elites, these princely states were being formed, and the essentially even the burghers, the other this kind of wealthy urban elites were actually quite supportive towards one another, even if they intrinsically were in kind of competition sometimes, because they wanted, for instance, they had a common interest on the countryside. Once again, other video I recommend is one of the peasant revolts in the late Middle Ages. I made, I think, 2. Look at medieval society playlist. You should find them. They're discussing essentially about this, how even the peasants at this time before the crisis were not definitely that living that bad. I mean, the typical stereotypical idea of the peasant, you know, slash kind of serf slash kind of slave that we have in mind, it's not a medieval thing. As a matter of fact, it's mostly a modern thing. At least looking at the standards of living conditions in the two eras, the average living condition. The first video I made was the one on late medieval peasant revolts, a decisive and lost battle, because in that video I stressed that basically also the peasants up to a certain point could even enter into the institutional system, because they were not so poor and weak as they were, and they actually made a freaking mess. Think about the Jacquerie and all these peasant revolts that went on and on. Sometimes later, think about early modern Germany, what happened in there with the peasant revolts. Or and the other video is thinking late medieval peasant revolts. It also deals a bit more in theory, a bit more philosophically with such ideas, but substantially deals with the same problem I'm posing now. So, excuse me here with the wires in the window, and oh my god, this is a mess every time. So, what else? So this was a general consideration, however, on the kind of how the also individual freedom entailed at the time. And as we were saying before, a great improvement of the communications and so on was due through the work and the effort of the merchants. The widening of the range of trade and the necessity to give it essentially a better organization brought several merchants to build companies and societies that were aimed essentially at sustaining the commercial companies, or even just one journey of one business journey, one expedition, one something like that. So that's how it began, basically. Initially speaking, there were just these contracts. There was the commendation, which is not what it means in English, by the way, but however, that's the commendatio in Latin. So the idea basically to commend, to entrust. So these were certain contracts basically to which one merchant was the commendatory before leaving, before beginning his journey, basically collected this excuse me. These loans, these financings, essentially, they were necessary for his journey. And it obtained this financing from people that where he would have come back, basically to whom he would give back this money to that had been loaned to him, with an addition of a part of the gains that he had obtained. So just imagine, you basically could invest in these activities. Many cities, especially the one in coastal areas, were based on this kind of trade. So what you could do was essentially to finance as a private citizen that maybe had not much to do with the trade business in itself, but was interested in making money. It was actually quite rare, because usually the economy at that point, it was the most remunerative activity at that point. So everybody, who especially was in the world of business, was kind of tied to it in one way or another, even indirectly speaking, like the whole city as a community. So you basically could, however, invest without having to leave with the merchant on the ship. That was also kind of a risky business in many ways, and simply paying the guy, saying, okay, I give you some money, and then if you come back, because obviously there was an intrinsic risk, as we've just said, tied to this activity, you, however, give me back the money I've loaned to you, that you use to carry out effectively your expedition, your business, your activity, and when you come back, you give me a part, essentially, of what you have earned, so that we all profit from it. And this was extremely important because it financed enormous activities at this point. As long as this naturally measures, it wasn't just a kind of abstract activity. It naturally entailed that it was already known more or less which kind of advantage of risks were present at this point, were inherent to that activity, and there was a general understanding since centuries now that those were things that paid off. But this was very important because there were enormous all this big financial activity in these centuries was essentially backed by people who were not in the business as active entrepreneurs. So the main problem also of the following economical collapse was that people stopped financing these activities when they saw that they were going down. And in fact, this was a moment where the I mean, after the crisis, essentially, there was a great coming back to the land. The late Middle Ages, after the crisis of the 14th century, came back looking at the land as the most profitable activity. And not just these financial activities that had started, albeit in part financed also by agriculture. This is very important as well. Those loans came also from landowners, for people were not in the business of trade, of sea trade and stuff like that. Maybe they were just knights who had come to live into the city and decided to invest into these activities because they were thought to be remunerated. They were paying off. But that's the idea. I mean, at a certain point, this big economical crack makes shifting radically the direction towards which these capitals were invested, and there is a coming back to the land that also favors, politically speaking, the re-feudalization of Europe in many ways, because the investment also in the countryside in this world was essentially was going in parallel with the strengthening of the investors and their political power into the countryside. So essentially, that's pretty obvious. If you invest in certain infrastructures that are yours and so on, you can control. You can also control who is around. You can control essentially the people who work in there, who maybe cannot at that point do not have your own same capitals because they're just peasants, while you come from the city, which doesn't matter how damaged by the crisis it was, but it was still very very wealthy and had very strong oligarchies that at that time had basically reinforced. So basically, you obliged the inhabitants of the countryside to work for you, to work initially, maybe just next to you, but then eventually absorbing their working force, because that was the trade. The trade really was about. In fact, many would think, wow, but especially the crisis after the Black Death happened into the cities, so theoretically now the countryside was the one that suffered the least. Well, this is not really true, because first of all, those peasants had kind of made a living up to that point, feeding the people who were in the city. So now they had a very few to sell to, in part. Also, the Black Death definitely hit also in the countryside, and one problem now is that lacking the whole economic system that now was basically collapsing because of this loss of resources, generally speaking, in the system, was practically frozen. So you literally lacked the money to invest into other activities, and this money was concentrated usually somewhere else, as we've seen. So, and by the way, there were also a lot of natural disasters, and the natural disasters at that point, paradoxically, would definitely hit hard also these major economical centers like the city were, but at the same time it made even these certain the same peasants starving to death. And the cities at this point had the means, by the way, to basically even the infrastructural means, the political connection to, for example, to buy grain from somewhere else. At this point, eventually during the crisis, but also before sometimes, there's a famine. On a regional scale, there is no way to, provincial scale, there is no way to find food, Where do you go take food? Somewhere else. You buy it overseas. You send fleets. You do it. What can the peasants do? The peasants will starve to death, and you would still have the money. So this is very interesting because it eventually brought to the collapse of the same peasant freedoms at the same time, and that's also part of the reason why they rebelled, initially speaking. I mean, that's why eventually in the mid 14th century the major revolts brought to there is this major crisis and also wars and so on. Think about the 100 Years' War. Brought to the Jacquerie, to this mass revolts of the peasants. That you say, oh, poor peasants. Yeah, they were kind of poor, definitely, but they also did freaking, horrible things, because they were objectively just sacking and pillaging and destroying and stuff like that. But aside from this, these are phenomena that you have to understand at a structural level. And that's how it basically happened. So we expanded a bit into also the crisis and post-crisis period. Coming back to the 13th century, we have seen this system of financing activities with the loans to enterprises, and the growing request for money triggered also the development of essentially credit activities, the so-called banks that were specialized in the exchange of money and in loans, naturally. So we're specializing in these activities, as we said before, entailed also a new studying of, a new understanding of mathematics, of accounting, of it needed certain administrative systems. There is at this time all the various branches of the various banks that existed in all the market squares of Europe. So you needed this system, for instance, of couriers, of messengers, of all these agents that were present all in the major markets at that point, that referred. So the myth of the medieval times as a closed period, people didn't connect, didn't communicate, absolutely false. Historically speaking, if someone had the money to know and had the interest to know what was happening on the other side of Europe, basically every place of the continent could be reached within a very few weeks by couriers, by messengers, and this has nothing to do with the mobility capabilities. It has to do with who paid you more. And at this point, if you got paid, you definitely could perform certain tasks, and quite effectively. And there were systems like this. The 13th century is a moment also in which the first paved roads, for instance, start to reappear. Naturally, there was kind of an exception, because paved roads are something that I think up to the 18th to 19th century kind of were pretty rare to find in the first place. But it's still important, because another characteristics of the 13th century is these huge expenses for public works. Sometimes, especially the cities, had so much money at a certain point that they didn't know how to spend them, literally. So what they did, basically, to increase their own political powers, was to fuel the clienteles by starting these enormous public works, like cathedrals, city walls, roads, and all this stuff, and public palaces, public palaces of government, etc. That maybe were just financed, and maybe they had to last generations before they ended, and were not even ended. Most of the European cathedrals actually were finished just in the 18th century, in the 19th century. Why? Exactly because of this reason. Because these works had been started into the 13th century, then the 14th century had brought an end to this amount of wealth. The works had stopped, and even in the essential, obviously the cathedral had been built. However, it had to be completed, and it took took centuries before it happened most of the times. This was a way we spend the money, we start these huge works, and then we wait. We don't care. The important thing is to attract workers that come live in here, that eat, that are lodged, so they pay taxes, they attract know-how, they attract wealth, because that was really the point. And they stick with us politically, so they're part of our system, and so we can get stronger also over our enemies, over our people. This is how it literally worked, and nobody actually cared whether that city wall was actually completed or not. The important is that there was this working place on. This construction site open, the building site open, and there were people working in there. And this entails naturally many different administrative practices for which people had also to be educated. And this is the time, for instance, 14th century Florence is it's the first community after Antonine Rome to be so literate, so educated. Before, Antonine Rome is the moment of the best time to be a Roman, like in terms of quality of life. And this is met, in fact, only at this point, actually in the 14th century Florence, before the crisis. Also in terms of literacy, etc. So this is how basically that obviously an important case, because Florence in that moment was literally the wealthiest city in the world. It had a higher GDP than the whole Kingdom of England alone. But so it's a kind of an exception. Obviously, this didn't happen everywhere. But broadly, however, there were certain studies. There was an expansion of these activities that entailed in part literacy and so on. These were things that eventually were not kind of lost with the crisis, because certain practices, also the crisis is actually it's not necessarily destructive. As a matter of fact, the crisis stimulates further, bettering of certain practices and so on. So it's not really there is a refinement, also technologically speaking, that is just often overlooked. Usually moments of crisis in history, some moments of great technological development, and even the great European growth of the 10th, 13th century was a bit of a moment of crisis in itself, if you want. It was a moment of attrition, it was a moment of a brutal expansion. Also in here, it was not necessarily just a qualitative improvement. It was also a sheer quantitative improvement that brought to the need of organizing this society in a better fashion. For instance, the crop rates. People say, oh well, then in this moment of revival, crop rates increased. Well, on average, probably. Well, we don't actually know. So the story that the 3-year rotation, the 3-year or the better improvement of the various agricultural tools were the cause of the revival. Absolutely not. Even from a technological point of view, that there is no evidence there was any consistent improvement, and that there were things that were basically just revived. In this period that were also known before, and the only reason that why they were revived was that they and that there was new wealth that had been accumulated. So it's most like as a consequence than a cause. So even the improvements at this point were occurring just because there had been a further improvement that doesn't explain why it happened, at least by those standards. Now, this is another topic, but just for saying that this enormous growth, even during the 13th century, was messing up a lot of things objectively. As we said before, there were lots of wars. Also, famines had become more frequent in the previous years. So it's really there was an expansion, but this doesn't necessarily entail any automatically an improvement of certain realities. Overall, there was naturally probably, yeah, life quality at this point was rising, but it still brought to many violent, sudden changes that were at this point even public authorities weren't able to compensate. We started the video talking about the pacification, public order, and so on. But this, yeah, it happened, but kind of at a small scale. But at a bigger scale, you see certain wars at this point were enormous, and the resources that were drawn to fight those were paid by the communities. So there was also a great moment of social crisis, especially at the end of the 13th century, for which it was understood that that's a kind of egalitarian system that the commoners especially had been had managed to build, etc. Now was still on the rise, but it was bringing to elites also within the commoners to take over eventually in terms of power over the whole society. Another phenomenon was related to the economical development and the growth in population after the year 1000 was the certain migratory fluxes, we can say. That is the shifting of big quantities of people towards the more productive areas. This is also very important, and this is what I was talking also about before in terms of the improvement, and you have to realize what it really was. Cities at this time weren't growing because people were more fertile. Cities were growing because people were coming to live in there. The growth, the economical and demographical growth at this point was considerable. For previous centuries, but was still something pretty low. Something you was also difficult with, you could spot with difficulty, especially in the countryside. It was not so evident. Maybe in the city it was, because maybe from a generation to another, things could really change. There could be so many people coming to live in there. That's where, in fact, the major changes were occurring, and these were occurring simply because these centers were attracting more people in terms of profits, of opportunities, and something like that. So also in here, an inherent competition, an inherent struggle. So a situation was all but actually, serene in its developments. So these migrations. This sounds outside. Wait a second. These migration flows were happening towards multiple directions. Some of them were happening, for instance, from the mountains to the plains. For instance, there is this problem of the mountain valleys where I would like to go so much in depth in medieval history. Unfortunately, I can't do it. But there is this beautiful words of the valley in the Middle Ages that is, it's loaded also with so many meanings, symbolical meanings, also in Christianism and so on, whatever. But the problem with the valley is that at this point, for whatever reason, there was an increase of population also in there, and the valley could not support it. It's kind of a closed environment. It doesn't have infinite resources of so much land to expand in. So from the mountains, there were lots of people now that were emigrating. Some of them would become mercenaries. Some of them would go to work into the cities, and this is also the element of the other migration flow, the major migration flow that I said before, from the countryside to the city. So this brings to a huge growth of urbanism, as we said before, that was unknown essentially from late Roman times. There were really many cities in Europe that were surpassing 10,000 inhabitants. Some even approached and sometimes reached and even surpassed the number of 100,000. Take this enormous cities like Milan or Paris or Cologne, also London at a certain point. In Italy alone, we can estimate from the beginning of the 14th century that Milan had 150,000 inhabitants. Venice and Florence roughly 100,000, Genoa 60,000, Verona, Brescia, Bologna, Pisa, Siena, and Palermo roughly 40,000. So at that time, these were huge centers, especially for European standards, objectively. The history of urbanism in the East is also very interesting, but now we can't cover it. So, among the other phenomena, there is that this urbanization brought to a sinking of manpower in the countryside. This was a shift in the balance, because at that point, it's kind of a paradox. These peasants were abandoning the country to go living into the city because they thought it was wealthier and they could make a living in there. At the same time, the problem now, the peasants abandoning the countryside was bringing to a collapse of manpower in there. So the food supplies for the cities were kind of sinking. Were increasing. The supply needs, the alimentary needs were increasing, especially when the needs of cereals that were kind of the most basic food that you could find. It was cheaper and you could feed more people. And this is also kind of an interesting phase of an interesting aspect in history, because here we think that life was bettering in some way. Yes, it did. But for instance, take alimentation, take food. It seems that in early medieval times, for instance, the diet was much more varied. Early medieval times shows us from evidence from archaeology that the average diet of the average European was much richer in fats and in proteins than now. Now the people were just eating this cereally derived thing, which is not very healthy. Too many carbohydrates are essentially detrimental. In fact, back in the day when from hunter-gatherers we passed to be agriculturers, there was a kind of a bettering lifestyle in certain measure, because there were more surplus coming from agriculture, but at the same time the human organism was not fit for eating. Human organisms should eat mostly essentially fats and proteins with a bit of carbohydrates, and mostly from food that comes from out in there. Lots of carbohydrates brought to in sanitary cultures a decline in lifespan. Despite life was kind of better by other standards in sanitary society, but this depends on so many factors, and there are also certain ideological interpretations. Now, it's not important for now. In the 13th century was also worse diet. All the people who came to work in the city were used like, also working in the city was not so romantic as we imagine. These people abandoned the countryside sometimes because of a famine or something dramatic that brought them out of there. It's not that peasants were inherently happy to go work in there. And in there they worked even harder and harsher than they were in the past. All these salaried workers, also especially in textile industry, and that was increasingly managed by these oligarchs in the city that were being exploited. And in fact, while with the crisis of the mid-14th century was a great these great rebellions, these great revolts into the countryside, also in the cities, the salaried workers began to rebel because they were exploited in a consistent way. So, however, all these problems now, also the cities were investing into the countryside. This is very interesting because the city, as we've seen now, had supply needs. They needed to feed all this huge amount of population that was unprecedented in one time. So this, interestingly enough, brought to an increase of centralization because there were needed more centralized administrative structures to control the system. It was ever larger. And now the city naturally was also powerful. It was powerful from a political and military point of view. They had their own militias that were expanding into the countryside. So the countryside was becoming a sort of land of conquest, and naturally the countryside were battled over with the rural elites of noblemen, of feudal lords that were there, so it was not so simple. But in the process, the idea was that the countryside was coming increasingly subdued to this or that lordship, and which invested essentially for the sake of its own supply system. So nobody cared essentially about the living condition of people who were living in there, and not that everybody really did in some measure, but this means that the cities were investing to increase production. So this introduced new agricultural. This is also what the feudal lords were doing, by the way. Now we started talking about the cities, but it's the same exact thing that feudal lords had done, and actually had begun to do before the city, historically speaking, because that's also thanks to the feudal system that cities managed to develop, and to the surplus that those agricultural resources had rendered possible with trade, as we've seen at the beginning of the video. So there were these things, these techniques that I kind of criticized before, that I'm talking about the dissemination of the 3-year rotation and the improvement of the various agricultural tools that definitely existed, but as we've seen, were more dictated by other needs that are kind of negative, not positive in intent, or better, they're not really progressive in nature. They were just triggered by the need of the city there, that could invest this more, in quality of certain systems, rather than letting the thing being organized by local peasantry that was definitely less organized than the cities were. This is also what brought the peasants to lose in the end, because the peasants didn't have a kind of they weren't aware of their own condition. They had very local roots. They didn't conceive themselves, on a broader scale, political or as a military ensemble. So they eventually ended up to, their fragmentation, their alleged egalitarianism basically was destroyed, but these entities were much more centralized, structured, like the cities, like the feudal states, and so on. And in fact, however, the real problem in here is that, in spite of the investments into these new forms of agricultural forms, there were not just technological, that it could affect really also the broad organization of the countryside as a territory, this patrimony, estate policies, and so on, did not allow to have a satisfactory crop rate for meeting the demand now. So this brought many landowners to basically to expand into new land. So this is actually in a nutshell, what made Europe grow at this point. It was not really the improvement in the crop rate, it was the literal expansion of the cultivated surface. So and this is what triggered in part also the improvement of certain techniques, because usually if those lands had been left out because they were, by conformation or location were not particularly fertile, so you needed basically to claim them back from the forest, from the swamps, and so on, and therefore also create other thing about the works of canalization. It was a technical improvement also from that point of view, but it was kind of pushed by desperation for the need of new food. So this is the general picture we generally have in this. So you see an improvement, but an improvement caused by struggle, and this is how basically technology advances. People today live in the myth that we live in a better world because of technology, and allowed us to live like that. It's not really that. It's the sweat and tears of people who had to invent those new technologies because they were desperate that brought to the creation of the technology that partly favored this growth. So it's not technology, but why you need it and why you built it, essentially, because technology doesn't pop magically out of the somewhere just because you wished for it. You have to work hard and to invest resources for creating it. So it's those resources, not the technology, that eventually bring to the improvement at the end of the day. And if you lack that basic amount of calories, because we're talking about physical things in here, the technology, you realize technology is just the tip of the iceberg of what really makes the move world. It's really the base that makes everything work. So from the last decades of the 13th century, what you realize is that this system, which had a great push, and had expanded so much, however, was in crisis because in spite of of all the expansion also into these marginal territories and so on, was inherently telling that the system was essentially about to drone, that it was lacking breadth, basically. And this crisis would manifest itself into the following century. So with premises that for this crisis that had already occurred into this 13th century, especially at its end, but also sometimes you can't really say when, because in my opinion, it's useful to see it as a series of desperate struggles, time after generation after generation, for which up to that point everything had kind of worked enough to expand, and then at a certain point there was no room, and the world system eventually collapsed. Considering that it had gained a lot of momentum thanks to the relative success that it had met in today's previous times. But it was a very turbulent world. I mean, really, probably we would be amazed to see how most of the times in history, these great advancements are actually, these great moments of an expansion and growth are actually characterized by an enormous strife, but by this brutal competition, this great and difficult effort to make it better. Naturally, this also largely depends on what what politics is, what society is, so that I don't know that there were better, worse times, but especially in a moment like the 13th century, objectively the fact that this progress was not channeled on kind of an ordered track, because the political entities were too weak, no matter how much they have been developing in recent times. They brought to an inherent disorder. I mean, an inherent disorder that couldn't be managed anymore. And this is kind of a sad realization that it is something I believe in general. I don't know if it is a catastrophic or ideal, but or not. But the idea is that humans do not actually understand the society they live in. I don't believe there is a human on Earth that knows how the world works, how human society basically works, really. It's really something that society, it's something so artificial from our hunter-gatherer basis, let's say, that also in there it could be criticized, that it's we don't know what we are doing. And so, at least today, maybe through technology, we have a kind of and certain wealth distribution, a certain level of education. We kind of having in mind roughly how things work, but still the system goes on by itself in a way that even if you understand it partly, you can't basically control it. and yeah, this is more or less how such things happen. And I don't know. There are many interpretations. I sometimes discuss these topics with other even unexpected people. Like, I don't know, my English teacher told me, how he sees history in this kind of cycle of crises that are ever greater in some ways. I don't really agree with it, um, but let's say that the inherent effort of society is something should really get more used to, because it's really a way into which we look at society today that it's kind of disconnected with reality, especially all these modernistic and technologistic prejudices that I often criticize. I think are very important, because really, how I think the average person looks at this phase in history, says something like, "Oh, look, this moment was a great growth. Yeah, it must have been cool, because we all know that growth is oh no, this was a mess." And it is true that this was a moment also of improvement in many fields, but at the same time, look at what it brought to a major collapse of this society, to a impoverishment of the average inhabitant, and ultimately to something else that definitely was positive, because after this we have the Renaissance, for instance. But the Renaissance was also the expression of a very elite world, and this is what is often forgotten. That humanism, Renaissance, were stemming from courts, not from the common, the free thinking. So it's all very controversial, and the problem is that there is no really we shouldn't interpret history in this good and evil track. We should look at it. I mean, obviously, you can also judge history morally, but you have to realize that there is a component of this society that basically, probably, society itself doesn't fully understand what it's heading to, and has also probably no great measure to stem it. And naturally, it was not even so dramatically dynamic as we imagine it. I mean, our society today is way more dynamic. Probably this society at the time was even more stable than we imagine, obviously. So that even when we want to narrate these episodes, this phenomena, we realize that yeah, it was a big crack. We like to emphasize the dynamic in itself, but after all, it wasn't a word that was radically changed. Even after the crisis. So this is in fact what you find in the sources, that if you read them, you realize, yeah, everybody says, yeah, at a certain point there's the plague, there are all these catastrophes and so on, but objectively, there doesn't seem to be a major reflection of what had happened. I mean, it was surely perceived, but it was even seen fatalistically, probably. This is another thing we tend to undervalue. Sometimes when you talk even with older generation, you sometimes ask them, but don't you care? When you were, I don't know, you were living in World War II, for instance, what did you think? And this person doesn't, just said, I was scared, I feared bombings, it was terrible, we were poor, we didn't have to eat, and so on. But then you realize that they haven't been reflecting about it in their own life. They're not aware of the general importance that experience can have, even inherently, for passing it to describing it to the following generations. This is kind of typical, because really older generations were kind of more simple-minded in the way we might think in a scale of probably this is. So just think about what the 13th century could really be in terms of also of approach towards reality, of control over the situation. I study a lot of political and military history of these years, of these centuries, in between the 13th and 14th century. What you realize in there is that there is a sort of mechanism in the way this world worked that wasn't much. That was aimed just at carving, of earning the tiny bit that it's basically took to survive. I mean, there was such a great pressure dictated by the intrinsic limits of these societies that it was even normal to look at society in a certain way. Today we arrived in a moment in history in which we look at society and say we are able to criticize it far and wide. And we have paradoxically the problem that we can't orientate ourselves among these views because sometimes they're so complex and looking so far that they even require intense studying. So those times were kind of aware of themselves in the way the world was supposed to be, because they had kind of rationalized. They had kind of not really rationalized because they weren't aware of that, but they had created a system that inherently at this point worked as a by itself, so that even certain ideals, certain beliefs, and so on were substantially there no matter what, and they were sticking to those. This is typical of more primitive societies, that there's sometimes very strong beliefs, especially certain rituals that are demanded by society because society has kind of interiorized them, and you just stick to them because as long as they work, they you kind of follow them by default, so you don't even waste time rationalizing it as a proper choice, as a proper event, as a proper theory as such. But you still go on, you still live on. These people, for instance, all the war they did normally, sometimes you study these sources and you realize they were fighting all the time. I mean, every year you knew that there was war. It was normal. It belonged to the average dialectics of the time. And you say, how could people live in a system like this? Continuous war, risk of famine, political instability, plagues, everything could happen, literally. And these people yet went on. And they were not even questioning it. I mean, sometimes they were saying, okay, we're fed up with war, we're fed up with violence. There was this great feeling, this great perception. You don't have to, even when you judge these people from a moral point of view, you don't have to say, oh, well, these people were insensitive. They didn't care. They just thought it was normal, so they were desensibilized to that. I don't know how to say that. They were not sensible to this. This is not true. These people felt it, but they still saw, or perceived, or understood in some way the reason why this was happening, because they saw it under their own eyes. Continuous war, for instance, war now. I don't know how many pacifists I have in my audience. I hope a very few, because I'm not a pacifist, and since I'm a Clausewitzian, I have very different views, and I'm very strongly opinionated about it. But the idea of war, looking at the past, I found actually lots of people out there say, war, we're such a destruction, such an inhuman activity. It's something that is pure evil in itself. My advice is study 14th century sources, study 13th century sources. Because if you do, you understand what it was like. You understand there was no option. Either it was you or it was your enemy. There were no ways you could make it. If you didn't take action, there was someone else who was taking it over you. And this obviously doesn't eliminate the intrinsic moral problem when these people did it. But one kind of empirical answer could be, they did it because just they were human in some measure. And humans in that particular environment made war because it was a universal activity at that time. So you can't say, there was someone who chose not to make war and everything was fine. Yeah, of course, there was the church, there were these ecclesia, but also in there, aside from the fact that also the church fought its wars, it had its armies, and pretty large and powerful ones, down in the truth, and so on.
But it was a matter of choice. This is also this moral judgment of what a terrible things that the Crusades and this, what did people do on average everywhere according to you? How are the Crusades intrinsically bad compared to all the rest of what's happening by standard in there? The only difference of Crusades is that, for the first time, there were certain Europeans going to fight instead in their own home somewhere else in the Near East. That's literally the only difference. In terms of religious justification, in terms of degree of violence, it was the standard for the whole world out there. You can't question and say, okay, well, certain massacres maybe were better, worse, were larger or smaller, but at the time, massacres happened. It doesn't matter if you kill 1,000 people, one at a time, or 1,000 people in one single time. The result is always 1,000 dead people. So in here, also, reading sources is very important because it makes you understand that this system went on in ways that for us are objectively very difficult to understand, and to a certain extent it's also impossible to understand because we don't know everything and how it really was at the time. But what you can see from it is definitely very educational because it tells you that there were certain dynamics that you couldn't escape from at that point. And there wasn't much of an option to behave in a certain way. So on this note of the conflictuality of that word, I would say I would stop the video now. I hope that you enjoyed it, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.